My daughter died on her honeymoon from an alleged sudden illness. At the funeral, I saw her husband laughing while whispering to a friend. When I asked the reason for his laughter, he replied, "Life has to go on. She's dead, but I'm more alive than ever." Suspicious, I broke into his house and discovered that subscribe to the channel for more stories like this and comment the city you're watching from. I never thought I'd bury my own daughter. At 62, I'd already said goodbye to my parents, my brother, even my wife Margaret 3 years ago. But Sarah, my beautiful, vibrant 34-year-old daughter, was supposed to outlive me by decades. She was supposed to give me grandchildren, supposed to visit me in whatever nursing home I'd end up in, supposed to be the one closing my eyes when my time came. Instead, I was standing in Riverside Funeral Home, watching strangers file past her casket, offering hollow condolences about her sudden passing during what should have been the happiest time of her life. Her honeymoon in Costa Rica had turned into a nightmare when she collapsed on the beach, clutching her chest. A heart attack, they said. Completely unexpected in someone so young and healthy. The whole thing felt wrong from the moment I got that phone call from David, her husband of exactly 8 days. "Mark, I don't know how to tell you this," he'd said, his voice strangely flat for someone who'd just lost his wife. "Sarah's gone. Her heart just stopped. The doctors here tried everything, but..." I remember dropping the phone, my knees hitting the kitchen floor of my small apartment. The sound that came out of me wasn't human. It was the cry of an animal whose young had been torn away. Mrs. Peterson from next door found me there an hour later, still on my knees, still making that sound. Now, 3 days later, I stood beside Sarah's casket, running my fingers along the smooth cherry wood. She looked peaceful, they'd said. But peaceful wasn't the word I'd use. She looked empty. The spark that had made Sarah who she was had been extinguished, leaving behind this shell that barely resembled my little girl. I'd raised her alone after Margaret died when Sarah was only 12. Those were the hardest years of my life, trying to be both father and mother to a grieving teenager while dealing with my own loss. But we'd made it through together. Sarah had grown into an incredible woman, kind, intelligent, successful in her marketing career. When she met David 18 months ago, I thought she'd finally found her happiness. Maybe I should have paid more attention to the warning signs. The funeral service had been beautiful, I suppose. David had spared no expense, which surprised me since he'd always seemed tight with money. White lilies everywhere, Sarah's favorite. A string quartet playing her favorite songs. An elegant reception with catered food that probably cost more than I made in a month on my pension. But it was during the reception that something shifted inside me, something that made my blood run cold. I was standing near the memorial table looking at photos of Sarah throughout her life when I heard it. Laughter. Not the gentle, reminiscent laughter of people sharing happy memories about the deceased. This was different, sharp, almost gleeful. I turned around and saw David standing about 10 feet away, his back to me. He was leaning in close to a woman I didn't recognize, tall, blonde, probably in her 30s. She was wearing a black dress that was appropriate for a funeral, but something about her presence felt out of place. She didn't look like she was grieving. She looked excited. David whispered something in her ear, and she covered her mouth with her hand, stifling another laugh. My hands clenched into fists. My daughter's body was still warm in her grave, and this man was having a private comedy show at her funeral. I walked over to them, my heart pounding with a rage I hadn't felt since my army days in Vietnam. The woman saw me approaching first and quickly stepped back, her expression shifting to something that might have passed for grief if I hadn't just witnessed what I'd witnessed. "David," I said, my voice low and controlled. "Who's your friend?" He turned around, and for just a split second I saw something in his eyes. Not grief, not guilt at being caught laughing at his wife's funeral. It was annoyance. Pure annoyance, like I was interrupting something important. "Oh, Mark," he said, quickly rearranging his features into what he probably thought looked like sorrow. "This is Jessica. She worked with Sarah at the Henderson agency. She was just sharing a funny memory about Sarah from the office." I looked at Jessica. She nodded enthusiastically, but her eyes were shifty, never quite meeting mine. "Yes, Sarah was always making us laugh during those long Monday meetings." She had such a wonderful sense of humor. Something was wrong with that statement, but I couldn't put my finger on what. Sarah had never mentioned anyone named Jessica from work, and Sarah had quit Henderson Agency 8 months ago to start her own consulting business. That's interesting, I said, still staring at Jessica. What department did you work in with Sarah? Jessica's face went blank for just a moment. We were in creative. David quickly jumped in. Jessica, didn't you say you needed to leave early? Don't want you to get stuck in traffic. She nodded gratefully. Yes, so sorry for your loss, Mr. She realized she didn't know my last name. Patterson, I said. Mark Patterson. And you are? Jessica Miller, she said quickly. Then practically fled toward the exit. I watched her go, then turned back to David. Funny memory, huh? What was so amusing about my dead daughter? David's jaw tightened. For a moment, his mask slipped completely, and I saw something that made my stomach turn. Cold calculation. Like he was deciding how much he needed to pretend to care. Look, Mark, I know you're grieving. We all are. But life goes on. Sarah wouldn't want us to spend the rest of our lives in misery. She'd want us to remember the good times, to find reasons to smile again. The casual way he said it hit me like a physical blow. She's been dead for 3 days, David. 3 days. I know that, he snapped, then quickly softened his tone. I'm sorry. I'm just trying to cope the best way I know how. Everyone grieves differently. But it wasn't grief I was seeing. It was something else entirely. Something that made every instinct I'd developed in 62 years of life start screaming warnings. As the reception wound down and people began to leave, I lingered, watching David. He moved through the crowd like a politician at a campaign event, shaking hands, accepting condolences, playing the part of the devastated widower. But I noticed things others didn't. How his eyes never quite matched his words, how he checked his phone constantly, how he seemed more focused on when people were leaving than on what they were saying about Sarah. When the last guest had gone and the funeral home staff began cleaning up, David approached me. Mark, I know this is difficult, but we need to talk about Sarah's things. The apartment, her car, her personal items. I'm flying back to Costa Rica tomorrow to handle some legal matters with the embassy, but when I get back, maybe we could go through everything together. Going back to Costa Rica, where my daughter had died under mysterious circumstances, where he'd been alone with her when it happened. What kind of legal matters? I asked. Just paperwork, death certificates, that sort of thing. It's complicated when an American citizen dies abroad. I nodded, but my mind was racing. Something about his whole demeanor was wrong. A man who'd just lost his wife of 8 days shouldn't be thinking about logistics and paperwork. He should be falling apart. He should be the one making inhuman sounds on kitchen floors. As I drove home that night, I couldn't shake the image of David laughing with that mysterious woman, Jessica Miller, who claimed to work with Sarah at a job Sarah had quit months ago. Jessica Miller, who seemed to know nothing about Sarah despite claiming to share memories with her. I sat in my apartment until 2 a.m, staring at the photos Sarah had sent me from Costa Rica just days before she died. She looked happy in those pictures, healthy, radiant, not like someone whose heart was about to give out. The last text she'd sent me was from the morning she died. Having the most amazing time, Dad. David's been so sweet, bringing me breakfast in bed every morning. Feel like I'm being spoiled rotten. Love you. Breakfast in bed every morning, David bringing her food. David who had complete access to whatever she ate and drank. I closed my eyes and tried to push the thought away. I was being paranoid. Grief was making me see conspiracies where there were none. People died young sometimes. Heart attacks happened to healthy people. It was tragic, but not necessarily suspicious. But as I finally fell asleep that night, one thought kept echoing in my mind. David's words at the funeral weren't the words of a grieving widower. They were the words of a man who felt more alive than ever. The next morning, I did something I never thought I'd do. I decided to break into my dead daughter's home. David had left for Costa Rica on the 6 a.m. flight. I'd called the airline pretending to be him, asking about departure times. The house would be empty, and I needed answers that I wasn't going to get by asking politely. Sarah and David's house sat in one of those newer developments, where every lawn looked like it came from a magazine, and every house was some variation of beige. I'd been there exactly 3 times since they'd moved in together. David had never made me feel particularly welcome, always finding reasons why visits needed to be short or why certain times weren't convenient. I parked 2 blocks away and walked, keeping my head down and trying to look like I belonged in the neighborhood. At 62, with my gray hair and dad jeans, I probably looked like half the residents anyway. The spare key was still where Sarah had always kept it, under the fake rock by the back patio. Some habits die hard, even when you remarry. I stood there for a long moment, key in my hand, knowing that once I crossed this line, there was no going back. If I was wrong about David, I was about to become the crazy, grieving father who broke into his son-in-law's house based on paranoid suspicions. But if I was right, the house felt different without Sarah in it. Cold, sterile, like David had already begun erasing any trace of her presence. I started in the kitchen, looking for anything that seemed out of place. The refrigerator was nearly empty except for some leftover takeout and a few energy drinks. No sign of the romantic breakfast-in-bed meals David had supposedly been making for Sarah. I moved to their bedroom, feeling like an intruder, but pushing forward anyway. David's side of the closet was immaculate, shirts organized by color, shoes lined up perfectly. Sarah's side looked hastily rummaged through, like someone had been searching for something specific. That's when I found the first piece of evidence that confirmed my worst fears. Hidden behind a stack of Sarah's sweaters, I discovered a small plastic bag containing pill bottles, not prescription bottles with pharmacy labels, just plain amber bottles with handwritten labels and David's neat printing. Magnesium supplement, read one. Vitamin D complex, read another. Heart health formula, read the third. I unscrewed the cap of the heart health formula and poured a few pills into my palm. They didn't look like any vitamins I'd ever seen. They were small, white, and had a strange chemical smell that made my nose burn. My hand started shaking as the implications hit me. David had been giving Sarah pills that he'd hidden. Pills that were supposed to be for heart health, but looked nothing like any legitimate supplement. I took photos of everything with my phone, then carefully put the bottles back where I'd found them. I needed more evidence before I could go to anyone with this. The search of David's home office revealed even more disturbing information. In a locked drawer that I managed to pry open with a letter opener, I found a stack of letters tied with a red ribbon. Love letters, but not from Sarah. The stationery was expensive, cream-colored, with embossed edges. The handwriting was feminine, flowery. I read the first one with growing disbelief. My darling David, I can't wait until we can finally be together without all this pretending. I know it's hard to keep playing the devoted husband, but soon Sarah will be out of the picture and we can start our real life together. The life insurance money will be more than enough for us to disappear somewhere tropical. Just a few more weeks, my love. Jessica, the woman from the funeral who'd been laughing with David, the woman who'd claimed to work with Sarah but knew nothing about her job. I read through more of the letters, each one more damning than the last. They'd been planning this for months. Jessica had been coaching David on how to slowly poison Sarah, making it look like she was developing heart problems. The Costa Rica trip wasn't a honeymoon. It was the perfect opportunity to administer the final dose, somewhere far from Sarah's doctors and family. The letters detailed everything. How David had been gradually increasing Sarah's symptoms over the past 6 months. How he'd convinced her to switch to a new doctor who didn't know her medical history. How he'd been documenting her episodes to create a paper trail of heart problems. In one letter, Jessica had written, "The beauty of this method is that it mimics a natural heart attack perfectly. Even if they do an autopsy, they'll just see cardiac arrest. No one looks for exotic plant toxins in a healthy 34-year-old woman." Exotic plant toxins. They hadn't just been giving Sarah supplements, they'd been poisoning her with something sophisticated enough to fool a medical examiner. I sat in David's leather chair, staring at the letters, feeling sick to my stomach. My daughter had been murdered, slowly, methodically, by the man she'd trusted enough to marry. And I'd sat there at her funeral, watching her killer laugh with his accomplice and done nothing. But the worst revelation was yet to come. In the bottom of the drawer, underneath a stack of insurance documents, I found something that made my blood freeze. It was a file folder labeled Research in David's handwriting. Inside were newspaper clippings, printed articles, and what looked like notes from online forums. The newspaper clippings were all about suspicious deaths. Young women who'd died suddenly of heart attacks. Women who had been married to men who collected large insurance payouts. Women whose deaths had raised questions but never led to convictions. One clipping was from the Dallas Morning News, dated 3 years ago. Local teacher dies suddenly on anniversary trip. The article described how 28-year-old Linda Morrison had collapsed and died while celebrating her first wedding anniversary in Mexico. Her husband told authorities she'd been complaining of chest pains for weeks, but had refused to see a doctor. I stared at the photo accompanying the article. Linda Morrison had been blonde, petite, and beautiful, just like Sarah, just like Jessica. But it was the handwritten notes in the margins that made me realize the full scope of what I was dealing with. David had written "too fast," raised suspicions next to Linda's article. Next to another clipping about a woman who'd died in Florida, he'd written "perfect execution, no investigation." This wasn't David's first time. Sarah wasn't his first victim. He'd been perfecting his method for years, learning from his mistakes, getting better at murder. I found more evidence that David had multiple identities, multiple relationships. There were emails from dating sites where he'd been courting other women even while married to Sarah, wealthy women, lonely women, women with substantial life insurance policies or inheritance money. The pattern was always the same. He'd sweep them off their feet with romantic gestures and talk of forever. He'd convince them to take out large life insurance policies, usually suggesting it as a responsible thing to do for their future together. Then, after the honeymoon period wore off, the women would start getting sick. Sarah had been victim number 4 that I could document. There might have been others. I photographed everything I could, my hands shaking so badly I had to retake several shots. This was evidence of multiple murders, evidence that my daughter had been killed by a serial killer who specialized in playing the perfect husband. As I prepared to leave, I heard something that made my heart stop. A car door slamming in the driveway. I froze, listening for footsteps. Had David come back early? Had someone seen me break in? I crept to the front window and peered through the blinds. It wasn't David's car. It was a blue sedan I didn't recognize. But the woman getting out of it I knew. Jessica Miller, the grieving co-worker who'd been laughing at my daughter's funeral. She was walking toward the front door with the confidence of someone who belonged there, someone who had her own key. I had about 30 seconds to decide what to do. I could try to slip out the back door and hope she didn't see me. Or I could confront her, right here, right now, and demand answers about what she and David had done to my daughter. As I heard her key turning in the front lock, I made my choice. I wasn't running. Not this time. Jessica Miller was about to find out that some fathers don't give up quietly when their children are murdered. I heard Jessica's heels clicking across the hardwood floor of the entryway, her movements casual and confident. She was humming something under her breath, a cheerful tune that made my skin crawl. This woman was walking through my dead daughter's house like she owned it, 3 days after helping murder Sarah. I positioned myself behind the kitchen doorway, my heart hammering against my ribs. Every instinct told me to slip out the back door, to take what I'd learned to the police and let them handle it. But 62 years of life had taught me that sometimes the system fails. Sometimes justice needs a push, and sometimes a father needs to look his daughter's killer in the eye. Jessica walked into the kitchen, still humming, and opened the refrigerator. She pulled out one of David's energy drinks and cracked it open like she'd done it 1,000 times before. That's when I stepped out from behind the doorway. "Hello, Jessica." She spun around so fast, the drink sloshed out of the can and splattered across the white tile floor. Her face went through a rapid series of changes: surprise, fear, calculation, and finally a fake smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh my God, you scared me," she said, pressing her free hand to her chest in an exaggerated gesture. "Mr. Patterson, right? From the funeral. What are you doing here?" "I could ask you the same question," I said, staying between her and the exit. "This is my daughter's house. What's your excuse?" Jessica's eyes darted around the room looking for escape routes. When she realized I wasn't moving, she straightened her shoulders and tried to regain control of the situation. "David asked me to check on things while he was out of town. Make sure everything was secure." She took a sip of her drink, trying to appear casual. "I have a key." "I bet you do," I said. "Just like you had a key to Sarah's life, her marriage, her death." Something shifted in Jessica's expression. The fake friendliness disappeared, replaced by something colder, more calculating. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, but her voice had lost its artificial sweetness. I pulled out my phone and showed her one of the photos I'd taken of her love letters. "My darling David, I can't wait until we can finally be together without all this pretending." I read her own words back to her. "Does that ring a bell?" Jessica's face went pale, but she didn't break. Instead, she did something I wasn't expecting. She laughed. "You went through David's private papers? That's breaking and entering, Mr. Patterson. I could call the police right now." "Go ahead," I said. "I'd love to explain to them what I found, starting with the poison you and David used to kill my daughter." "Poison?" Jessica's laugh became shriller, more forced. "Sarah had a heart attack. It's tragic, but it happens. Sometimes young, healthy people just die." The casual way she said it, like Sarah's death was nothing more than an unfortunate coincidence, made something snap inside me. I stepped closer, and Jessica instinctively backed against the kitchen counter. "You killed her," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "You and David fed her poison for months, made her sick, made her weak. Then you took her to Costa Rica and finished the job." Jessica's mask finally slipped completely. The fake grief, the pretend concern, all of it vanished, revealing what was underneath. She looked at me with pure contempt, like I was an insect that had crawled out from under a rock. "You can't prove anything," she said. "Sarah's body was cremated in Costa Rica. No autopsy, no evidence. Just a tragic young woman who died of natural causes on her honeymoon." The fact that she knew Sarah had been cremated, something I hadn't even known until that moment, sent ice through my veins. They'd planned every detail, including making sure there would be no body to examine later. "Why?" I asked. "Why Sarah? What did my daughter ever do to you?" Jessica shrugged like we were discussing the weather. She was convenient, young, healthy, trusting. Perfect life insurance material. David has a talent for finding women like her. Women like her? Rich enough to be worth the effort, naive enough to fall for his act, isolated enough that no one asks too many questions when they die. Jessica smiled, and it was the coldest thing I'd ever seen. Sarah was particularly easy. Daddy issues made her desperate for male approval. David barely had to try. I wanted to hit her. The urge was so strong, my hands actually twitched, but I forced myself to stay controlled. I needed her to keep talking. How many others were there? Jessica tilted her head, considering. Sarah was number 5 for David, but he's not the only one I work with. You'd be amazed how many lonely hearts are out there just waiting for the right person to take advantage of them. Work with. She talked about murder like it was a business partnership, like my daughter's life was nothing more than a transaction. "You're a serial killer," I said. "I'm a businesswoman," Jessica corrected. "There's a difference. I don't kill for pleasure, I kill for profit." It's much more civilized. She was enjoying this. Enjoying the chance to explain how clever she was, how perfectly she and David had executed their plan. The arrogance was breathtaking. "The heart medication Sarah was taking," I said. "What was it really?" "Digitalis extract," Jessica said proudly. "Derived from foxglove plants. Completely natural, impossible to detect unless you know exactly what to look for. In small doses over time, it weakens the heart muscle. In large doses," she shrugged. "Well, you know what happened in Costa Rica. You poisoned her breakfast." "David did, actually. I was just the brains behind the operation. David's good with the emotional manipulation, but he's not particularly bright about the technical details. That's where I come in." Jessica finished her energy drink and set the can on the counter with a soft clink. "I have to say, Mr. Patterson, I'm impressed. Most family members just accept the tragic accident story and move on with their lives. It takes real dedication to break into someone's house and go through their private papers. Sarah was my only child. Yes, David mentioned that. How sad for you. There wasn't an ounce of genuine sympathy in her voice, but you should know that this conversation never happened. Even if you went to the police with your theories, what would you tell them? That you broke into a house and found some love letters. That's not evidence of murder, it's evidence of adultery. And adultery isn't illegal. She was right, and we both knew it. Everything I'd found could be explained away. The letters proved David was cheating, but not that he was a killer. The pills could be dismissed as supplements with misleading labels. Without Sarah's body to examine, without witnesses to the actual poisoning, I had nothing that would stand up in court. Besides, Jessica continued, who's going to believe that a respected businessman like David is actually a serial killer? He's charming, successful, seemingly devastated by his wife's death. You're just a grief-stricken father looking for someone to blame. What about the other women? Linda Morrison in Dallas. The others David researched? Jessica's eyes narrowed. You've been very thorough, haven't you? Yes. Linda was one of ours. Poor girl never saw it coming. Neither did the others. She paused, studying my face. But again, what are you going to do with that information? Those cases are closed. No one's looking for connections. I am. You're one old man with a grudge, Jessica said dismissively. David and I have been doing this for years. We're very good at covering our tracks. Then why are you telling me all this? Jessica smiled again, and this time it was almost pitying. Because there's nothing you can do about it. Because even if you went to every police department in the country, even if you screamed the truth from the rooftops, no one would believe you. Because in a few days, David will come home from Costa Rica and will disappear. New identities, new hunting grounds, new victims. And Sarah's life insurance money will fund our next venture. David's already identified several promising candidates. Wealthy widows are particularly easy targets. When the casual way she discussed their future plans, as if Sarah's murder was just the first step in a larger business strategy, made me realize something terrifying. These weren't desperate criminals making impulsive decisions. They were organized, experienced, and completely without conscience. There is one thing I'm curious about, Jessica said, tilting her head like a predator studying prey. How did you know to look for the pills? Most people would have accepted the heart attack story without question. A father knows when something's wrong with his child. Touching, she said mockingly. Well, your paternal instincts were correct. Sarah did suffer before she died. The digitalis makes the heart race, makes breathing difficult. She probably felt like she was drowning in her own body. But don't worry, it was relatively quick at the end. That was when I lost control. Hearing her describe my daughter's final moments like she was discussing a medical procedure, I lunged forward. But Jessica was younger and faster. She sidestepped my grab and pulled something from her purse, a small canister of pepper spray. I wouldn't do that if I were you, she said, pointing it at my face. This conversation has been educational, but it's over now. She started backing toward the front door, keeping the pepper spray trained on me. Here's what's going to happen, Mr. Patterson. You're going to forget everything you think you learned today. You're going to go home and grieve for your daughter like a normal person, because if you cause any trouble for David and me, if you go to the police or try to interfere with our plans, I'll make sure your death looks just as natural as Sarah's. You're threatening to kill me? I'm promising to kill you, Jessica said matter-of-factly. The only reason you're still alive is because David thought it might look suspicious if Sarah's father died right after she did. But accidents happen all the time to old men. Heart attacks, falls downstairs, gas leaks, so many tragic possibilities. She reached the front door and paused with her hand on the knob. Goodbye, Mr. Patterson. I hope for your sake that this is the last time we see each other. The door closed behind her with a soft click, leaving me alone in my dead daughter's house, with the knowledge that her killers were about to disappear forever, and there wasn't a damn thing I could do to stop them. I spent the next 2 days in a state of rage-fueled planning. Jessica thought she'd silenced me with her threats, but she'd made a crucial mistake. She'd underestimated what a father would do to get justice for his murdered child. I wasn't some naive old man who would quietly accept defeat. I was a Vietnam veteran who'd spent 13 months in the jungle learning how to hunt men who wanted to kill me. Age might have slowed my reflexes, but it hadn't dimmed my determination. If the legal system couldn't touch David and Jessica, then I'd have to handle this myself. I used my time wisely while David was still in Costa Rica. I visited a private investigator I'd known from my days working security at the shipyard, a man who specialized in cases the police wouldn't touch. For $300, he ran background checks on both David and Jessica, using databases that weren't available to ordinary citizens. What he found confirmed my worst fears and revealed new horrors I hadn't imagined. David Thornton wasn't even his real name. He was actually David Marcus Webb, and he had a criminal history going back 15 years. Fraud, identity theft, and 2 suspicious deaths that had never been prosecuted due to lack of evidence. The police had investigated him in connection with his first wife's death in Nevada, but the case had gone cold when the primary detective was transferred and key evidence mysteriously disappeared. Jessica Miller was really Jessica Ann Kovach, and she had her own impressive record. She'd been suspected in the deaths of 3 elderly men in different states, all wealthy widowers who died shortly after making her the beneficiary of their life insurance policies. Like David, she'd never been successfully prosecuted, but she'd left a trail of suspicious deaths across the country. Together, they were a perfect predatory team. David handled the romantic seduction while Jessica managed the technical aspects of the murders. They'd been working together for at least 3 years, and the investigator estimated they'd killed at least 8 people for financial gain. My daughter had been their latest victim, but she wouldn't be their last unless someone stopped them. The investigator also provided me with David's flight information. He was scheduled to return on Thursday evening, landing at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport at 8:45 p.m. That gave me 2 more days to prepare. I spent those days learning everything I could about digitalis poisoning. I visited the library, researched online, even called an old Army buddy who'd become a doctor. The more I learned, the more I understood how perfectly Jessica and David had planned Sarah's murder. Digitalis affects the heart's electrical system, causing irregular rhythms that can mimic natural heart disease. In therapeutic doses, it's actually used to treat certain heart conditions. But in the doses they'd been giving Sarah, it would have gradually weakened her heart over months before the final, lethal dose triggered the massive cardiac event that killed her. The beauty of their method, from a killer's perspective, was that it looked completely natural. Even if doctors suspected poisoning, digitalis breaks down quickly in the body and can be difficult to detect unless they know specifically what to look for. They'd chosen their weapon well. On Thursday evening, I was waiting in the airport parking garage when David's flight landed. I watched him emerge from the terminal wheeling a small suitcase and checking his phone. He looked relaxed, almost cheerful. A man returning from a successful business trip, not someone who'd just murdered his wife. I followed him home at a distance, staying several cars back. David drove like someone without a care in the world, occasionally singing along to whatever was playing on his radio. Seeing him so carefree while my daughter lay dead made me want to ram my truck into his car and end this right there, but I had a better plan. I waited until David had been home for an hour before making my move. I wanted him to feel safe, to think he'd gotten away with everything. I wanted him relaxed and confident when I knocked on his door. David answered wearing a bathrobe and holding a glass of wine. When he saw me, his expression shifted from mild curiosity to something that might have been concern, but not fear. Not yet. "Mark," he said, opening the door wider. "This is unexpected. Is everything okay?" "I need to talk to you about Sarah," I said. David's face arranged itself into an expression of sympathetic grief. "Of course, come in. I know how hard this has been for you." I stepped inside, noting how different the house felt with David in it. Where it had seemed cold and sterile before, now it felt actively malevolent, like the walls themselves were contaminated by his presence. Can I get you something to drink? David asked, closing the door behind me. Coffee? Something stronger? I'm fine, I said. I wasn't about to accept any food or drink from a man who specialized in poisoning people. David led me into the living room and settled into his leather chair with the practiced ease of someone returning to familiar territory. Everything about his demeanor suggested a man in complete control of his environment. How are you holding up? He asked. I know losing Sarah has been devastating for both of us. Has it been devastating for you, David? Something flickered in his eyes, so quickly I almost missed it. What do you mean? I mean you seem to be handling your grief remarkably well for a man who lost his wife of 8 days. David's grip tightened almost imperceptibly on his wine glass. Everyone processes grief differently, Mark. Some people fall apart immediately, others compartmentalize, deal with the practical matters first. I've always been more of a compartmentalizer. Is that what you call it? Mark, I'm not sure what you're getting at. I leaned forward in my chair, studying his face. I'm getting at the fact that you murdered my daughter. The words hung in the air between us like a challenge. David's expression didn't change immediately. He was too good an actor for that. But I saw the calculation behind his eyes, the rapid assessment of threat levels and response options. That's a serious accusation, he said finally. And frankly, it's hurtful. I loved Sarah more than life itself. You loved her life insurance policy more than life itself. David set his wine glass down with deliberate care. Mark, I understand that you're grieving. I understand that you need someone to blame for this tragedy. But Sarah died of natural causes, a heart attack. It's been confirmed by the Costa Rican authorities. Authorities who never performed an autopsy because you had her cremated immediately. I had her cremated because that's what she wanted, David said, his voice gaining strength. We discussed it before the trip. She was afraid of being buried alive, some childhood phobia. She made me promise that if anything ever happened to her, I'd make sure she was cremated. It was a good lie, plausible, emotional, impossible to verify. But I knew Sarah, and she'd never mentioned any fear of being buried alive. In fact, she'd once told me she wanted to be buried next to her mother when her time came. That's interesting, I said, because Sarah told me just last month that she wanted to be buried in Greenwood Cemetery next to Margaret. David's composure slipped slightly. People change their minds about those things. The conversation we had was very recent. Show me the pills you were giving her. What pills? The heart medication, the supplements, the ones you hid in her closet. David's face went completely blank. For a moment, he looked like a computer that had suddenly been disconnected from its power source. I don't know what you're talking about, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. I found them, David, along with Jessica's love letters, the ones where she talks about the life insurance money and how easy Sarah was to manipulate. That's when David's mask finally came off completely. The grief-stricken widower disappeared, replaced by something cold and calculating, something that looked at me like I was a problem to be solved rather than a person to be deceived. You broke into my house. Yes, I did. That's illegal. So is murder. David stood up slowly, his movements deliberate and controlled. You can't prove anything, Mark. Even if you found some pills and some personal correspondence, that doesn't prove murder. At best, it proves I was having an affair. It proves you were planning to kill my daughter for money. It proves I was unhappy in my marriage and considering leaving, David corrected, which isn't a crime. He walked over to the window and looked out at the street, his back to me. When he spoke again, his voice was different, colder, more honest. Do you want to know what your problem is, Mark? You think this is some kind of movie where the good guy always wins and justice always prevails. But this is real life. In real life, sometimes bad things happen to good people, and sometimes the people responsible get away with it. Not this time. David turned around, and I saw something in his face that made my blood freeze. It wasn't anger or fear. It was amusement. Yes, this time too, he said. Because you're one old man with no evidence, no allies, and no legal standing. Even if you went to the police with your theories, what would happen? They'd investigate, find nothing concrete, and close the case. Meanwhile, Jessica and I would disappear, and you'd spend the rest of your pathetic life knowing that your daughter's killers got away with it. The casual cruelty of his words hit me like a physical blow. He wasn't just admitting to Sarah's murder, he was taunting me with my inability to do anything about it. "There's something else you should know," David continued, settling back into his chair like we were having a pleasant conversation. "Sarah wasn't as innocent as you think. She knew about Jessica." "What?" "Oh yes. About 2 months before the wedding, she found some of Jessica's letters, had a complete breakdown about it, threatened to call off the wedding, expose everything." David smiled at the memory. "That's when we decided to accelerate our timeline. Originally, we'd planned to wait a year or two before the accident, but Sarah forced our hand. She knew you were planning to kill her. She knew I was cheating. She suspected I was after her money. But she was too in love, too desperate to be married, to do anything about it. So, we convinced her to go through with the wedding anyway. Told her we could work through our problems on the honeymoon." David's smile became more pronounced. "She actually believed we were going to couples therapy in Costa Rica. Right up until the morning she died, she thought she was saving our marriage. The image of Sarah dying alone, betrayed by the man she'd trusted enough to marry, was more than I could bear." I stood up abruptly, my hands clenched into fists. "Easy there, Mark," David said. "Remember, you're in my house. If something happened to you here, it would be self-defense. An old man having a heart attack during a heated argument about his daughter's death. Tragic, but not particularly suspicious. Are you threatening me? I'm educating you. This is how the game works. Jessica and I are professionals. We've been doing this for years, and we're very good at it. You're an amateur who's stumbling around in the dark, making noise, and drawing attention." David picked up his wine glass and took a leisurely sip. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to go home and grieve for Sarah like a normal father. You're going to stop breaking into houses and making wild accusations. And in a few weeks, when the insurance money comes through, Jessica and I are going to disappear to somewhere warm and sunny. And if I don't cooperate, then you'll join Sarah sooner than you planned," David said matter-of-factly. "It really is that simple." I stared at him for a long moment. This man who'd destroyed my daughter's life for money. This predator who was already planning his next kill. This monster who thought he was untouchable. "You're right about one thing," I said finally. "This isn't a movie. Good guys don't always win, and justice doesn't always prevail." David nodded smugly. "Exactly. I'm glad you're finally understanding reality. But you made one mistake, David." "What's that?" I smiled for the first time since Sarah's funeral. "You assumed I was one of the good guys." David's confident smile faltered slightly at my words, but he quickly recovered his composure. "What's that supposed to mean?" I stood up slowly, feeling every one of my 62 years in my joints, but also feeling something I hadn't experienced since my army days. The cold, calculating mindset of someone who'd decided that rules no longer applied. "It means you've been playing a game where you thought you knew all the players," I said, "but you never bothered to learn about Sarah's father. Hippopomers. You're a retired dock worker with a high school education," David said dismissively. "What exactly am I supposed to be afraid of? I was a dock worker for 30 years after I came back from Vietnam, but before that, I spent 13 months in the jungle learning how to hunt men who were trying to kill me, men who were a lot smarter and better trained than you." Something shifted in David's expression. Not fear yet, but uncertainty. "That was 50 years ago, old man. On some skills you never forget." I walked over to the window where David had been standing moments before. "Like surveillance. Did you know I've been watching this house for the past 3 days, learning your routines, your habits, your vulnerabilities?" That was a lie, but David didn't know that. I saw him glance toward his phone, probably calculating how quickly he could call for help. "For instance," I continued, "I know that Jessica visits every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon. I know that your nearest neighbors are the Hendersons, and they're both deaf as posts. I know that you always close your blinds at 9 p.m. and that you sleep with your bedroom window cracked open because you run hot at night." David's face was getting paler with each detail. Even though I was making most of it up, enough was probably accurate to shake his confidence. "I also know that you made a crucial mistake when you chose Sarah as your victim." "What mistake?" "You assumed that when she died, she'd just disappear from the world, that there wouldn't be anyone left who cared enough to ask questions or demand answers." I turned away from the window to face him directly. You never counted on her father being the kind of man who doesn't give up. David reached for his phone, but I was ready for that. 40 years of physical labor had kept me stronger than he'd expected. I grabbed his wrist before he could dial, my grip tight enough to make him wince. "Let's not involve outside parties just yet," I said. "We're having such a nice conversation. Get your hands off me." I released his wrist, but didn't step back. "Tell me about Linda Morrison." David's eyes widened. "Who?" "The teacher in Dallas who died on her anniversary trip 3 years ago. Your first successful kill, according to the newspaper clippings I found in your office." "I don't know what you're talking about." "You kept notes, David? Critiques of your own work. Too fast, raised suspicions you wrote next to her article. You learned from that mistake, didn't you? That's why you took so much longer with Sarah." David was backing away from me now, but there wasn't much room to retreat in his own living room. He bumped against the wall and stopped, trapped between me and the corner. "You're insane," he said, but his voice was shaking. "You can't prove any of this." "I don't need to prove it to a court," I said quietly. "I just need to know it's true. And thanks to your little speech a few minutes ago, I know it is. You're not a killer, Mark. You're just a grieving father." "You're right. I'm not a killer." I paused, letting that sink in. "But I'm also not stupid enough to think that going to the police will get me justice. So I've decided to handle this a different way." "What way?" Instead of answering, I pulled out my phone and showed David the screen. It was a recording app, and it had been running for the past 20 minutes. "Everything you just told me about Sarah's murder, about Jessica, about your other victims, it's all recorded. High-quality audio that clearly captures your voice." David's face went white. "You can't use that in court. It was recorded without my consent." "You're right again, but I'm not planning to take it to court." I stopped the recording and saved the file, then opened my email app. "I'm planning to send copies to the police departments in Dallas, Nevada, Florida, and everywhere else you and Jessica have left bodies. I'm also sending copies to several journalists who specialize in cold cases." "That won't accomplish anything," David said, but he was starting to sweat. "They'll investigate and find nothing, just like before." "Maybe. But this time, they'll have a clear confession from you describing your methods. They'll know exactly what to look for, and more importantly, they'll know that you and Jessica are still active." David lunged for my phone, but I'd expected that. I sidestepped his grab and pushed him back against the wall harder this time. "The recording is already uploaded to cloud storage," I said, "along with photos of everything I found in your office. Even if you managed to destroy my phone, the evidence would still exist." "What do you want?" David asked, and for the first time since I'd known him, he sounded genuinely afraid. "I want you to call Jessica. Tell her to come over right now." "Why?" "Because she's half of the team that killed my daughter, and I want both of you together when I spring my trap." David shook his head frantically. "I'm not calling her. I'm not doing anything until you tell me what you're planning." Wait, I showed him my phone again, this time opening my contacts list. "Then I'll just send those recordings to the police right now." "Wait." David held up his hands. "Wait, let's talk about this rationally. The time for rational conversation ended when you murdered Sarah. Now, we're in damage control territory." "What kind of damage control?" I smiled, and I could see in David's eyes that he finally understood what kind of man he was dealing with. "The kind where you and Jessica disappear permanently, but not in the way you were planning. You're talking about murder. I'm talking about justice. There's a difference." David was breathing heavily now, his confident facade completely shattered. "You can't do this. You're not a killer." "You keep saying that, but I've killed before. 12 men in Vietnam, all in situations where it was them or me. I didn't enjoy it, but I didn't lose any sleep over it either." That was actually true. The war had taught me that sometimes violence was the only language certain people understood. Sometimes the choice came down to letting evil flourish or doing something terrible, but necessary to stop it. "This is different," David said. "This is cold-blooded murder." "No, David. What you did to Sarah was cold-blooded murder. What I'm planning is pest control." I pulled out my phone again and started dialing. "I'm calling Jessica myself. I'll tell her you need to see her urgently about the insurance money. She won't come if she thinks something's wrong. Then you better make sure she doesn't think something's wrong." I held the phone out to him. talk to her, convince her to come over, and if you try to warn her or signal that something's wrong, I'll send those recordings to every law enforcement agency in the country." David stared at the phone for a long moment, weighing his options. Finally, he took it. "Jessica, it's David." His voice was remarkably steady for a man whose hands were shaking. "I need you to come over right now. Something's come up with the insurance claim." I could hear Jessica's voice through the phone, but couldn't make out the words. "No, it can't wait until tomorrow," David continued. "The investigator wants to meet with both of us tonight. If we don't handle this now, it could delay the payout for months." More conversation from Jessica's end. "Yes, I know it's late, but this is a $2 million payout we're talking about. It's worth one evening of inconvenience. $2 million, the price David had put on my daughter's life, the amount he and Jessica thought justified murder." "Good. Yes, come straight here. Use your key." David ended the call and handed my phone back to me. "She'll be here in 20 minutes. "Excellent." I pocketed the phone and settled back into my chair. "Now we wait." "What are you going to do to us?" "That depends on how cooperative you are." David slumped into his chair, his head in his hands. "This is insane. You can't just take the law into your own hands. The law failed my daughter. The law was going to let you and Jessica disappear to kill again. Sometimes a father has to take matters into his own hands." "We could make a deal," David said suddenly, looking up with desperate hope. "The insurance money, we could split it. You could have half. $1 million? No questions asked." The offer was so obscene, so fundamentally misunderstanding of what this was about, that I actually laughed. "You think this is about money?" "Everything's about money, Mark. That's how the world works." "Not everything. Some things are about love. Some things are about justice. Some things are about making sure that monsters like you don't get to hurt anyone else." David fell silent, finally understanding that there was no negotiating his way out of this situation. We sat in tense silence for the next 15 minutes. David kept glancing at the clock on his wall, probably hoping Jessica would be late or decide not to come. But I knew she would. The promise of insurance money was too tempting for someone like her to resist. Finally, I heard a car pulling into the driveway. David looked at me with something that might have been pleading in his eyes. "Last chance," he said. "We can still work something out." "You're right," I said. "This is your last chance to do the right thing and confess what you did to Sarah." The sound of Jessica's key in the front door echoed through the house. David's shoulders sagged into defeat. "She's here," he said unnecessarily. "Yes," I said, standing up and walking to position myself behind the door. "She is," Jessica's voice called out as she entered the house. "David, where are you? What's this about an insurance investigator?" I listened to her heels clicking across the hardwood floor, coming closer to the living room. In a few seconds, she would walk through that doorway and find herself face to face with the father of the woman she'd helped murder. "We're in here," David called back, his voice barely above a whisper. Jessica appeared in the doorway, still talking. "I hope this doesn't take long. I have an early meeting tomorrow and I need to—" She stopped mid-sentence when she saw me standing behind the door. Her face went through the same rapid series of changes I'd seen in the kitchen 3 days earlier. Surprise, recognition, fear, and finally cold calculation. "Hello again, Jessica," I said, closing the door behind her. "I think it's time the three of us had a more honest conversation." Jessica's eyes darted between David's pale face and my position blocking the door. I could see her mind working, calculating escape routes and threat assessments with the same cold efficiency she'd used to plan my daughter's murder. "Mr. Patterson," she said, forcing her voice to remain steady, "this is unexpected." "I imagine it is. Have a seat." "I'd rather stand." That wasn't a request. Jessica looked at David, probably hoping he'd take control of the situation, but David was staring at his hands, defeated and broken. She was on her own. "What do you want?" she asked, settling onto the edge of the couch like she was ready to bolt at the first opportunity. "I want justice for my daughter. Since the legal system isn't going to provide it, I've decided to handle the matter personally." Jessica's composure cracked slightly. "If you're planning to hurt us, you should know that people know where I am tonight. If I don't check in, nobody knows you're here," I interrupted. "David told you this was about an insurance meeting. A private meeting that you wouldn't want anyone else to know about." The truth of that statement settled over Jessica like a cold blanket. She was trapped, and she knew it. David recorded a full confession about Sarah's murder, I continued. He told me about the digitalis poisoning, about your other victims, about your plans to disappear with the insurance money. Jessica shot a venomous look at David. You idiot! You told him everything? He didn't have a choice, I said. I can be very persuasive when someone's murdered my child. So what now? Jessica asked. You turn us in to the police? We've been through this before. They can't prove anything. Actually, I've moved beyond the idea of involving the police. Something in my tone made both David and Jessica look at me with new attention. Fear was finally beginning to replace calculation in their expressions. What do you mean? David asked. I mean that you're both going to confess to Sarah's murder. Not just to me, but to the authorities. You're going to provide detailed information about your other victims. You're going to make sure that every family who lost someone to your schemes gets the truth. Jessica laughed, but it sounded forced. And why would we do that? That would be suicide. Because the alternative is worse. You're threatening us again. I'm promising you something. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a small glass vial filled with clear liquid. Do you know what this is? Both David and Jessica stared at the vial, but it was Jessica who understood first. Her face went white. Where did you get that? I have a friend who's a research chemist, retired military like me. He's very good at synthesizing compounds when properly motivated. What is it? David asked. Concentrated digitalis extract, I said. The same poison you used to kill Sarah, but in a much more concentrated form. A few drops of this in your drink and you'd be dead in minutes. Jessica was backing away from me now, but there was nowhere to go. You're bluffing. You're not a killer. I keep telling you both, you don't know me as well as you think you do. I unscrewed the cap of the vial and both David and Jessica flinched at the sound. Here's what's going to happen, I said, my voice calm and controlled. You're both going to drink some of this poison. Not enough to kill you immediately, but enough to start the same process you put Sarah through. You're going to experience exactly what she experienced. You're insane, David whispered. Then, while you're feeling your heart start to race and your breathing become difficult, you're going to call the police and confess to everything. You're going to provide details about all your victims, explain your methods, give them everything they need to close those cold cases. And if we do that, Jessica asked, then I'll give you the antidote. What antidote? I pulled a second vial from my pocket, this one filled with a different clear liquid. Activated charcoal suspension with cardiac stabilizers. It won't completely reverse the effects, but it will prevent the poisoning from becoming fatal. And if we don't confess, then you die the same way Sarah died, slowly, painfully, knowing that there's nothing you can do to stop it. The room fell silent except for the sound of David's labored breathing. Jessica was staring at the vials in my hands like they were venomous snakes. You don't have the nerve, she said finally. You're not a cold-blooded killer like us. You're right. I'm not like you. I looked at both of them, these monsters who had destroyed my daughter for money. But Sarah was everything to me. She was my only child, my only family, my only reason for living. You took that away from me for $2 million. I opened the digitalis vial completely. The chemical smell filled the air. I've already lost everything that mattered to me. I have nothing left to lose and nothing left to live for except making sure you pay for what you did. This is murder, David said desperately. No, David, this is poetic justice. You're going to die the same way you killed Sarah and all your other victims. The only difference is that you'll have a choice in the matter. Jessica was shaking now, her earlier confidence completely gone. How do we know the antidote will actually work? You don't, but it's the only chance you have. I walked over to David's wine glass, which was still sitting on the side table where he'd left it. Very carefully, I added 3 drops of the digitalis extract to the wine. This should be enough to start the process, I said. In about 10 minutes, you'll start feeling the effects. Rapid heartbeat, difficulty breathing, chest pain. Sound familiar? David was staring at the wine glass like it was his own death warrant, which, in a sense, it was. You're going to drink that, I told him. Then you're going to call the police and confess. If you do it convincingly and provide all the information they need, I'll give you the antidote before the poison becomes fatal. And if I refuse, Then I'll force it down your throat and let you die slowly while I do the same thing to Jessica." Jessica suddenly lunged for the door, but I was ready for her. I grabbed her arm and spun her back into the room, my grip firm enough to leave bruises. "Sit down," I ordered. She sat, tears of fear and rage streaming down her face. "I prepared a second dose for you," I told her, pulling out another vial of digitalis. "You'll get to watch David go through what Sarah experienced. Then you'll get your turn." "Please," Jessica whispered. "We'll confess. We'll tell them everything. Just don't poison us." "Words are cheap, Jessica. You've lied about everything else. Why should I believe you now?" I handed David the wine glass. "Drink it." David stared at the glass, his hands shaking. "I can't. Sarah couldn't choose whether to die or not. She trusted you, and you murdered her. Now you get to make the choice she never had. This is wrong. What you did to Sarah was wrong. What you did to Linda Morrison and all the others was wrong. This is justice." David lifted the glass with trembling hands. "If I drink this and confess, you'll really give me the antidote? If your confession is complete and truthful, yes." David looked at Jessica one last time, then closed his eyes and drained the wine glass in 3 quick swallows. The effects began almost immediately. Within 5 minutes, David was sweating and clutching his chest. His breathing became rapid and shallow. "Call the police," I said, handing him my phone. "Tell them you want to confess to the murder of Sarah Patterson and multiple other victims." David dialed 911 with shaking fingers. When the operator answered, his voice was already strained with the early effects of the poison. "This is David Webb," he said. "I need to confess to several murders." I listened as David provided his address and told the operator to send detectives immediately. While he talked, I prepared a dose of digitalis for Jessica. "Your turn," I said when David finished the call. "He hasn't confessed yet," Jessica protested. "He just called them." "He will. The poison is already working. Soon he'll be desperate enough to say anything if it means getting the antidote." David was doubled over now, gasping for breath. Sweat poured down his face as his heart struggled with the chemical assault. "Please," he whispered, "the antidote. Full confession first. Start with Sarah." For the next 20 minutes, David provided a complete account of how he and Jessica had planned and executed Sarah's murder. He described the gradual poisoning, the fake supplements, the final dose administered during breakfast on their last morning in Costa Rica. Then he moved on to their other victims: Linda Morrison in Dallas, Robert Chen in Nevada, Martha Williams in Florida. Names and faces of people whose only crime had been trusting the wrong person. Jessica drank her dose of poison when the police sirens became audible in the distance. By the time the detectives entered the house, both killers were experiencing the full effects of digitalis poisoning and were desperate to provide any information that might save their lives. I gave them each a dose of the antidote, real activated charcoal that would slow the absorption of the poison and prevent fatal cardiac arrest. They would survive, but they would spend the rest of their lives in prison for their crimes. As the paramedics loaded David and Jessica into ambulances, Detective Martinez took my statement. I told him about finding the evidence in David's house, about the recorded confession, about my decision to extract justice when the system had failed. "You know we'll have to charge you with assault and false imprisonment," Martinez said. "I know. You could go to prison. I know that too." Was it worth it? I looked at the ambulances pulling away, carrying 2 serial killers who would never hurt another innocent person. I thought about Sarah, about the justice she would finally receive, about the other families who would finally have answers about their loved ones. "Yes," I said, "it was worth it." 6 months later, David and Jessica were both convicted of multiple counts of first-degree murder. David received 4 life sentences without parole. Jessica received 3. The insurance money went to Sarah's estate, and I donated every penny to organizations that helped families of murder victims. I pled guilty to assault and was sentenced to 2 years in minimum security prison. It was a small price to pay for justice. On Sarah's birthday, I visited her grave for the first time since the funeral. The headstone was simple granite with her name, dates, and a single line: "Beloved daughter and victim of a father's love." I placed fresh flowers on her grave and sat down in the grass beside her. "I got them, sweetheart," I whispered. "They'll never hurt anyone else again." The wind rustled through the trees, and for just a moment I could almost hear Sarah's voice telling me she loved me and that she was proud of what I'd done. Justice had finally been served, and for the first time since that terrible phone call from Costa Rica, I felt at peace.